So we've seen over the last few years AI reach levels of IQ around 155. So which means that it's on a pure IQ test, it's perhaps equal to 1 out of a few thousand people.
What will happen to the economy? What will happen to our jobs? Will everyone become more or less unemployed because of AI and AGI?
We and most of the people we are around love their work and don't expect ever to stop working, like Joe Biden, I guess. But yeah, the next 5 years will be very dramatic in white-collar work.
But I think it's still just a question of time before it can be automated away. Personally, I'm excited because then I'm saying, okay, maybe I can do something more interesting.
All of the ones who wants to work do more what you call labor of love. So things they really find interesting.
Horses more unhappy, or are they happier today than before?
I think that example is absolutely spot on, because they are clearly happier today. Because now we have them because we love them.
So we'll be in a situation where cost of living goes down and the return on capital goes up. So instead of needing $5 million, you need $500,000.
We might be talking about 0.001% of what it cost before.
Then the rule of thumb that you can spend around 4% of your net worth might change to that you could spend, let's say, 8%.
Equity investments will be trending faster up the next 20 or 30 years than I've done, let's say, the last 200 years.
These robots and AIs be able to produce 10x more effectively. I also think we will see unemployment. People may see declining living standards.
Several good reasons for pursuing UBI. Somebody have to step forward and make it work, though.
A political exercise that will not be straightforward.
And there we get into a really confusing situation, because what if the biggest intellect is not us, but AI?
Hi and welcome. Today we're going to talk more about how artificial intelligence and innovation is going to impact the markets. We're going to talk about the labor markets. We're going to talk about the economy. We're going to talk about UBI. And with me today, I have Lars Tvede, who is a known investor and entrepreneur, and an author of, I think, is it 16 books, Lars?
17, writing number 18 with you. And the Chief Technology Officer from Deloitte. We are almost finished, but now comes brushing up, the final improvements.
Yeah, and we're actually discussing some of the points about the future and how it will impact all of our lives in the book. But I think right now a lot of people are thinking about like what will happen to the economy, what will happen to our jobs. And I think we're both quite fascinated by a new report from Anton Korinek, I hope I pronounced that correctly, talking about the impact on the labor market. So I think maybe let's start there, and maybe let's discuss. So what do you think in the short and in the longer term? Will everyone become more or less unemployed because of AI and AGI, or do you think it's like it has always been that there will always be demand for human labor?
I think, first of all, let's look at history. So the Industrial Revolution started in Scotland, in a tiny corner of the world there, around 1775 or so. And since then, we have seen something like 98% of human labor being automated. So what all these people who are working today are doing is that they're doing the remaining 2%. So there is some economic logic that explains why that was possible. So it's called Say's law, and it says that when you automate something, you are able to produce more, but then that creates more wealth, and that wealth is then distributed to people who then use that money to buy other things. And then all the time, humans find a way to move in and do these other things. So what I see a theoretical possibility, so an economic possibility for a lot of people not to work. And one might choose to organize the society in that direction. But there's also a possibility to have all of the ones who wants to work do more what you call labor of love. So things they really find interesting. And I think we'll be better at adapting that than many people fear. And I also want to say that people who are completely aware of Say's law and what has happened in the past, they say, yes, but this is different because it will go so fast. And there are two elements of this. First of all, there's AI. Maybe we should talk a little bit about what are the important things that have happened and will happen in AI. So you and I have co-authored a lot in the book about that. So we've seen over the last few years AI reach levels of IQ around 155. So which means that it's on a pure IQ test, it's perhaps equal to 1 out of a few thousand people. It's that brilliant, but of course it's not. The profile is not identical to a human, so there are things that it does worse, especially when we consider Mower's paradox that AI is not so good at navigating in the real life, but it's very, very good at intellectual challenges. But when we look at what is actually working in AI and how does it work, I get to think about a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman, and I know you have read that as well. It's a very good book, and he describes what is scientific consensus, but he describes how we have this big brain, which is super fast, and this is our intuitive brain. That's the one that processes an absolutely enormous amount of tokens, so representations of meaning in our everyday life, and it doesn't make us exhausted. It does it at a frantic speed, and we in our book we have an example of, we imagine this example, but I have actually tried it myself. So there's an animated group sitting at a dinner table and sitting and talking and waving around with their arms, and then suddenly John hits a glass and it falls over the edge of the table. And then Jim catches in the air. So I've done this twice in my life. I caught a falling glass in there. So it's mind-boggling what goes on in your brain there, because if it had been a glove or a napkin, you would, in a fraction of a second decide that there's no reason to try to avoid that. It's fine. If it was a napkin, you wouldn't pick it up either. If it was a glove, you would pick it up, but you not try to catch it in there. But then moving, twisting your body, reaching out, open your fingers, catching it, and all of that happens so quickly. So this is one out of many, many things that this fast intuitive part of the brain can do. Also, let's say I meet Susan, whom I haven't seen for a while, and then I say, how are you? And then she says, I'm fine, but I can see tiny, tiny movements in her facial expressions that tells me otherwise. And then I ask her, are you sure? And then she starts crying, and then she spills the beans and all the things that are not fine. So can AI do that? So the answer to that is that this is the part that AI has been struggling with. But the other parts, intellectual challenges, of course, where it's been absolutely excellent. Beating world chess champions, winning the game of Go, and also winning Go game is particularly interesting because first they made AlphaGo, and then they made how was it? There were two names of the two games that I made with 1 year's difference, but the second version of AlphaGo trained itself by playing just games against itself several million times, and it did that in 9 hours. So playing frantically, learning, and then creating all these different models that evaluate other models and so on in a kind of Monte Carlo simulation. So in 9 hours, it became better at playing Alpha or Go than any other person in the world. So what we have experienced already now is that AI can solve a lot of intellectual challenges, orders of magnitude better and faster than intellectual workers. If you work with, let's say that you are a nerd, complete nerd. You actually are a complete nerd, I think, maybe. So, and I have a bit of the same, but let's say that you are sitting every day and reading every day for 8 hours, 5 days a week, 225 days a year, perhaps, then you'll probably process something like 15 million tokens. So an AI can do that in seconds. So there's an asymmetry right now in how much AI can take in and process, and then how well it can process what comes out. And there are already a lot of people working on getting it better to structure work, structuring its output. And that means that it has to move from being good at the type 1A brain, the intuitive brain, to emulating also the type 2 brain, which is more iterative, step-by-step logical thinking. And you can do that by having a number of different AI agents that each contribute with a specific part of what has to be done. And then you get this whole feeling of it's like communicating with or getting work done by a very analytical, creative person. But in fact, it's a lot of different modules. And Jeff Hawkins he has written a book called 1,000 Brains that both of us have read. Where there he explains how the human brain consists of a lot of different modules. Each is tuned for a specific task and not for other tasks. And this is what we're getting to now. So where I'm going with this is that for dealing with intellectual work, AI is very, very quickly getting to the point where it can take over not only individual efforts, but team efforts or the output of entire companies and completely automated. And then the second thing is the robots, so hyper-intelligent robots. When Ray Kurzweil, you recently did a online review of Ray Kurzweil's new book, The Singularity is Nearer. So I noted that he wrote that he thought the big revolution in hyper-intelligent robots will happen around 2029. I think it might happen before, but it's, how do you define a big revolution? But I noticed that there was a Chinese company that recently released a humanoid robot that cost $16,000, 1.80 meters tall. I think it weighed 46 kilos, could fold itself into a shape so you could have it on your flight if you want to. Let's say that 5 years from now, this is connected to hyperintelligence. And there are many of them, and the price of dropped to $10,000, and it can work 20,000 hours before it's completely worn down. So that would bring, if we ignore interest on the purchase price, that would bring the price of running that down to about $0.50 an hour. And it can work day and night, never tired, never on holiday, no trouble. And then, of course, you have to pay for electric power. But you found, what was it, like less than $0.50 an hour, or something like that?
Yeah, and it's also something that's going to evolve quite quickly, right? So I found the estimation that right now investing in a robot plus the energy might be about $10 an hour, but in 10 years it could be less than $1 an hour, and in 10 more years it will not even be 10 cents an hour. So nothing human labor could ever compete with.
Yeah, then you'll probably get, like you do with so many other industries, that robots as a service. And the one part of it that people have been talking a lot about already is, of course, transportation as a service, where you have these self-driven cars and you just click on your app like you do with Uber, and then this thing comes and picks you up and takes you to where you want to go, and that will cost maybe 10% or less what it will cost at least a typical city dweller to own a car. But let's say that you have a villa, you are sitting in your villa right now, and you told me yesterday that it has a quite complicated garden, and you are spending a ton of money on gardening. So it would be nice just to click for a gardener, right? And then this robot comes and And there are some situations in life where we really prefer a human worker, and other situations where we prefer a robot. But I think, let's say that it's weekend and you and your wonderful family are out there in your bathing clothes. You don't want a gardener. You would prefer a robot gardener instead of a real gardener, doing the garden 3 meters away, I think. But let's say that you are doing a garden party, and then there you'd like to have a cook, and then maybe it's far more charming to have a real cook that people can talk with and who presents the food. So there are parts where we would prefer robots, and there are parts where we prefer humans.
A lot of people, they view much of this as a bad thing, right? I think both of us, we are thinking, well, this will be really cool to experience. Um, but the question is, I mean, is this a good thing, or is this a bad thing that people will get out competed by robots and AI? So one of the comparisons we have talked about before are horses, who pretty much got competed away by the automobile. The automobile was more efficient and a lot cheaper. Um, and then one of my questions was, but are horses more unhappy, or are they happier today than before?
I think that example is absolutely spot on, because they are clearly happier today. Because now we have them because we love them. And you can take some other examples, like why did people, maybe 20,000 years or 30,000 years ago, why did people start living alongside wolves? It was a practical synergy. The wolf would get some extra meat, I suppose, not being the humans, but from their meal. But then would protect them, and then gradually we started breeding them, and then all the like 160 different kinds of dogs we have now come from the wolves. But it's not. I mean, with a very very few exceptions, it's not really practical for people to have a dog today. I understand when you have super high risk of crime, for instance, it can be, but for most people, so I'm in Switzerland, you're in Cyprus, we're both Danish national. In these places, people have dogs because they like them, and you have to take them to the vet, and you have to feed them, and all the rest of it. Um, but the same with cats. In the old days, you had cats to eat mice at the farms, and now it's the same thing. It's a hassle, but you like them. Old timer cars. I have been collecting old timer cars, and I can tell you they're not practical. They're not cheap either, but I like them, so I bought them anyway. And I think we have to, when you say, we can think of people or compare what happened to the horses to what happens with people now in the future. I think we have to think about that. There's a very big business model in being cuddly, likable, helping each other with all sorts of things, body and mind experiences, and so on. And I think that we will be very good at finding a way in this. But of course, it will be turbulent. And as with any transition, there will be people who are not good at converting to what makes economic sense, and other people will thrive. You sent me an overview of some examples of blitz scaling companies. I don't know if you can remember the numbers right out of your head, but the different companies within recent years that have reached a market cap or an exit value of more than $1 billion, down to a handful of employees, very few years old. So there will be opportunities, I think, in this AI dominated future for very small teams, or perhaps even single people, mobilizing huge swarms of AI agents that cooperate, and to some degree you only have to kind of put them on a path, and then they evolve automatically and just become better and better at doing what they do. But as a founder, you own it, and the operating costs are minimal. And so there will be people who very, very quickly build huge fortunes on doing that. And then there will be other people who say, "Oh, I don't really have to work. I prefer not to." And surely, I mean, you and I come from an environment where we and most of the people we are around love their work and don't expect ever to stop working, like Joe Biden, I guess. but but if you think about pension age around, especially in around Europe, when in France and other places where the government goes out and say we have to raise the pension age, and then you have huge strikes and complete chaos because people don't want it. So there are lots of people who don't like their work and would prefer not to work or work less, and many of them perhaps would like to work, but with something more interesting. So this is something that this will enable, I think.
But you might say it's not that hard to imagine kind of the end game scenario of this. There will not be a lot of these traditional jobs left. But I think a lot of people would have their corporate jobs, they would earn quite well, and they would say, "Oh, this is all well and good, but what will happen to me in the next 5 and 10 years? How is this going to play out? Will I earn more money? Will I earn less money? Will I be made redundant? Will I need to reschool myself?" So I think looking at, for example, Anton Korinek's report, there's some very interesting points on, well, how could this play out? And I think maybe let's try and paint a picture more vividly. So one of the things Anton talks about here, he's talking about the level of investment in artificial intelligence and robotics versus the speed of automating. And he's explaining that if the speed of automation actually exceeds the level of capital invested, then it will create less jobs and lower wages, if I understand it correctly. But if there's plenty of capital to invest, it will actually, at least in the beginning, accelerate the number of jobs and the wages.
Yeah, I think it was very timely and useful paper he did. It's not necessarily a super easy read because it's full of math. But what he describes is textbook macroeconomics. So it's not a French theory. It's well known stuff, and it's been proven consistently for hundreds of years. Um, but but as you said, that let's say we have an example where uh, a person is working with a machine, and then the machine gets twice as efficient, and certainly that person can produce twice as much working with that machine. And then if the demand doesn't go up, then you don't need a person; you need half a person because you still want to sell the same amount. So what he explains is that every time you have automation, if you can make the GDP grow in the same proportion as the automation factor, then you don't get structural unemployment. Of course, you will always get a lot of turbulence where people have to change jobs. But the solution to this huge change that we are facing I think, within the next 5 years in particular, is that we have to invest heavily in these technologies. But when you post about it on social media, as you and I and many others have done, then you very often see in the commentary people suggesting to inhibit this technology wave, for instance, putting heavy tax on robots, which is exactly what will create unemployment. And the opposite, which I think is the right thing to do, is to try to stimulate massive rollout of these excuse me, of these technologies, but also make it compelling for people to get ownership of this, and for instance, to remove capital gains tax on equities, so that people can take some of the savings put into equities where they participate in ownership of robots and AI, and then they get the capital gains as well. Because it's difficult to predict the nature of the turbulence in job markets, but it's easy to predict that the capital gains will be quite explosive in some parts, and the more people have a participation in that, the better. And we have the markets for it, but we have taxes that often are against it.
So if we look at the three graphs that Korenik he presents, basically the two first graphs just show that jobs will be automated away once we get to AGI. So one says, how does this look if AGI is here in 5 years? How does it look if AGI is here in 20 years? But it's basically the same scenario. I think a lot of people would be interested in your view on, like, how quickly do you think this will actually happen? I mean, one thing is, let's say AGI or some form of advanced AI with capable models that can replace most workers would be here in 5 years. Do you think it will then happen super quickly, or do you think there are so many things that will delay it, such as like politicians that might make rules against it, governments that will be slow to react, companies that will actually not react because there are so strong forces within the companies to slow down the development for you could say more egoistic reasons, like you would like to keep your job, thus you don't want like the AI explosion to occur in your company. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, I think that solving some remaining issues on AI, the ones we talked about earlier, about type system 2 thinking, iterative thinking, which also includes, for instance, delivering the conclusion for a complicated prompt as in a scaffold structure, which have different elements that are treated differently and so on. This will be extremely well solved within the next 1 or 2 years. And then, of course, there's a delay in rolling it out, and because of the delay in existing organizations, you will see very aggressive startups going in and filling the space, exactly the same as you saw with the internet. But I think it will be quite dramatic in the next 5 years or so, because the technology will be there. Now, also the technology is quite simple and cheap to implement compared to getting a grip on the internet when that started. For many people, you have access to this incredible intelligence absolutely for free, on the spot, on wherever you are. But in corporates, people will be very good at rolling it out. So, yeah, the next 5 years will be very dramatic in white collar work. So with the blue collar, I don't know if, as I mentioned before, the Ray Kurzweil thinks that it will really take off in 29. That will certainly exist maybe in 26 or so in a very high quality. But eventually we'll be able to produce work for labor forces in factories. And if we just compare a couple of things, it gets really interesting, because what did it cost society to create you and me? Okay, so we both come from Denmark. We grew up first taken care of by our parents, and in school, high school, and then we got a education, university education. So if you take the combined cost of all of that, was perhaps around $400,000 in deflated money. If you do the same calculation in Mexico, perhaps it's 150,000, but it's still money. But also, even though we both had student jobs, you could say on average, when did we start, delivering full-time work? It was perhaps when we were 23 or so. If you have less education, it will be earlier. But let's say that on average in a modern society like that, it takes 22 years and costs $400,000 to create a workforce. Now, how long time does it take to create a robot by a Chinese producer like Unitree? They can probably do it in a day when they're really up and running. It's just a mass production. And if it costs $10,000, it's really, really a lot cheaper to make a robot than to make a human, but it's also a lot cheaper to run a robot than run a human. And there's also another factor, and that is where the robots have to work in many settings. You have these huge costs in, for instance, a factory building or an office building. But if you have robots that work 24/7, 365 days a year, you get a far higher return on your whatever infrastructure, physical infrastructure you need. So they will be so much more efficient. So I think the blue collar revolution comes closer to 2030, will be more gradual. But between, let's say, 26 and 2035 or so, this will also be massive. And we'll start seeing these robots in our daily life and perhaps in your garden and so on. And they will really make an impact. So the next 10 years would be very dramatic, I think. And and we'll fumble around. So where would you be most nervous? In which jobs would you be most nervous about this?
Yeah, as you say, I think in the white collar jobs, probably. I think there's, you could say, either you could be excited, right? Either you could say, well, I actually don't love what I'm doing. I would like to evolve and do something else. If you forget kind of the economic component, um, and of course people could say, yeah, but I'm creative, or it's a complex set of tasks I'm doing. But I think it's still just a question of time before it can be automated away. Personally, I'm excited because then I'm saying, okay, maybe I can do something more interesting with my time, as some tasks, or almost all tasks, are getting automated away. But I do understand the worry, right? Because in reality, what will happen? We will see these robots and AIs be able to produce 10x more effectively. So the good part is that we'll get some, I think, high quality products at a much lower price. I also think we will see unemployment because, like we talked about, if 98% of jobs have already been eroded by technology, then if the same happens again, but in only 10 years, I don't think we can catch up as humans. I think that will cause some form of unemployment. But the question is here, then what happens, right? And this is where I think the worry kicks in. Can I receive a UBI that will be equivalent to what I was able to make in my white collar job? I think that's kind of the main question and the main worry. My own answer would be, in the beginning, maybe not. In the beginning, some people may see declining living standards.
We just need to define UBI. I think it's universal basic income. So this is like no questions asked, fundamental income for every citizen in a society.
Exactly right. And I think I've been trying to calculate it, and I know you have seen some calculations from Denmark as well. The challenge is, if you take a country like the US and you say every individual, including kids, should receive $2,000, no questions asked, a month, then that right now that's not possible. But if we can make the cost of living decline as a result of AI, if we can make the government much more efficient, then we can work our way to a situation where this might be possible. But I think it's a political exercise that will not be straightforward.
Yeah. So the example in Denmark was a political party that actually they made a proposal for UBI. I think they withdrew it later because it was unpopular, but they had the Ministry of Finance do the math, and it would work. And the a part of the calculation is that a Scandinavian style welfare system is incredibly expensive to run. So there are different factors in it. First of all, a substantial part of the workforce is doing administration of it. So if you assume that workforce moves to private sector and produces products and services which have a commercial demand, then that will boost the useful GDP. And then second, there are some negative psychological consequences of having a very big, elaborated welfare system. And so one of the things is that once you go to this county office or wherever it is to apply for some kind of support, you have to explain why you are needy, and that means you have to present yourself as being in a weak position and implicitly weak. And so there are some negative psychological effects of that. We all know from positive psychology, as it happens to be called, that one of the ways to success is you kind of have to look the part. You have to walk, with your back straight and say, "I'm gonna win" before you are gonna win, and so on. Fake it before you make it, and all the rest of it that entrepreneurs know so well. So when people they get into this public sector system and they have to present why everything is hopeless and they can't find a solution and so on, they get mentally locked into that situation. But then let's say that you are then a recipient of social welfare, you have achieved that, and then you find a way to have some success, professional success in your life. But then you risk that you'll drop out of the public support. So you choose not to pursue that avenue to success. And then you're kind of locked in the system perhaps for the rest of your life. So when you add all these effects up, it can actually, it is doable to have UBI. But the income from it cannot be very high. So in this, the case that I referred to, it was about the same level the grants that students get, university students get, which allows you to live if you have a room in a college, you can pay for your food. You can also have a little holiday and so on, but not much more than that. So the idea should definitely be that if you have this offered for everybody, that is at a level where you're not suffering, but you have a clear incentive to do more, and then you are not punished at all for doing more. You are only rewarded for doing more. But the other aspect of this, which you alluded to before, is that perhaps basic services will become so cheap that it becomes easier and easier to live from a very, limited income. We could imagine factories, dark factories in principle. We might not even see them. They might be underground, where you just have these robots producing what we want 24/7, and at a fraction of what it costs today. And of course, a lot of intellectual work doesn't even need factory buildings. It's just some cloud somewhere producing all of that. And that's not much of the intellectual work. We are not talking about 10% of what it cost before. We might be talking about 0.001% of what it cost before to do some of it. So it's certainly there will certainly be several good reasons for pursuing UBI. Somebody have to step forward and make it work, though, in a community before the rest will follow.
So I guess an alternative, a personal alternative to UBI, is try to achieve some form of financial freedom. Of course, it's not possible for everyone, but I'm also thinking like the bar for that might be lowered quite a lot. So I think currently for a family, most people would say that they would need maybe between 2 and 4 million euros in net worth, like invested in stocks or real estate, and they would be able to live off of that for the rest of their lives, right? Which is based on kind of the current expenses.
But you're talking about, for instance, EU, US, South Korea, Japan.
Exactly. Yes. So more expensive parts of the world, maybe not Silicon Valley, but or New York, but more expensive parts of the world, you would need, I think, between 2 and 4 million US dollars or euros, and you would be fine if they're invested in a kind of diverse portfolio. One argument would be that this amount would become a lot less in an AGI future because prices would then decline. And I'm wondering, could there be another argument saying, since we're taking work partly out of the equation, could capital become, could the interest from capital or the capital gains increase? So we'll be in a situation where cost of living goes down and the return on capital goes up. So instead of needing $5 million, you need $500,000.
I think that's a very interesting perspective, and I think the answer is a little bit off here, in my opinion, because many of the things you can do, especially with AI without robots, so purely intellectual world, doesn't require much capital. So the value is in the idea. It's in the ability to design and orchestrate this system that runs by itself. Sometimes you can almost comparing to that sounds very negative, but light a fire in a forest. It's not a big work, but once it's there, it just goes by itself, right? Perhaps it's a better example to put two fish in a pond and then you come back and there's 1,000 fish. You just have to seed the idea and then it goes by itself. It costs almost nothing and generates its own income almost entirely from the start. And this is also characteristic of some of the Blitz scaling companies that we have seen in the recent decades, where many of them got pretty far with very little capital. And with AI, this will be amplified a lot. So the biggest return will be on intellect. And there we get into a really confusing situation, because what if the biggest intellect is not us, but AI, which is exactly where we are heading. But it is to get control of really smart intellect, and then let it do its thing, and then you just get the money starts flowing.
But if you're concerned and say, okay, eventually I will probably lose my well-paid job, but let's say the average person is fine with that, as long as they are kind of financially free and can maintain their lifestyle. But they might say, okay, UBI may not be coming as soon as I need it. Would you buy into the idea that the capital gains will be bigger in the future as a result of AGI, and that costs would be less? Do you believe in both of those dynamics, or do you mainly believe that AGI will just increase deflationary pressures?
Yeah, so I think that the return on equity investments will be trending faster up the next 20 or 30 years than I've done, let's say, the last 200 years. So there's a university professor called Jeremy Siegel who has made the most prominent calculations of historical returns on different investments. He wrote a book called Stocks for the Long Term, which was one of the books that influenced my thinking a lot when I was a lot younger. And so if you take the long-term trend in stock markets returns and add, it's not only the prices, but also you add in the dividends that you get and you correct it for inflation, then it compounds at about 6.9%, which is now called the Siegel's constant. So what I'm saying is I think the trend will be more than 6.9% over the next 20 or 30 years. And there are two reasons for that. The first one is that AI and its effects on both white collar and blue collar work will increase the structural growth rate by quite a lot. Different companies have made different estimates. For instance, Goldman Sachs has estimated that trend growth rate in unit labor productivity, so the productivity per worker, white collar or blue collar, would grow from, was it 1.3% to 2.8%, so more than double because of AI. They didn't look very far into the future, but I think that will be possible for several decades. So higher growth means in isolation means higher return on capital investments in equities, at least. But it's also very deflationary. We already talked about that, how it will drive down the prices of basic goods, but also in intellectual services and so on. So if you have the combination of higher growth and lower inflation, you have Goldilocks. And Goldilocks is where equities do really well. And I'm not talking about what they'll do in next week or next quarter or so. I'm talking about the average growth rate over several decades, I think will be high. So it is very important to incentivize people to tap into this. Pensions can be a part of it, for instance, and you have many places where substantial fraction of the pensions have to be in government bonds. I think that's very bad. I think they need to be in equities, and so tapping into what goes on in the productive part of the society instead of financing the overspending of the state. So some societies will be good at dealing with this. I suspect a lot of societies will be bad at it. And it goes back to whether you have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. So if you have a growth mindset, just a very basic way to express it is that you have a growth mindset. You think of the economy as a bakery that makes cakes. If you have a fixed mindset, you think about it as a cake. So here's a cake. How do we divide this cake? With a growth mindset, here's a bakery. How do we incentivize them to make more cakes? And we have, since, as we talked about, in order to avoid economic problems and turbulence because of AI and its consequences, we need to invest a lot in it so we get high GDP growth. And then we need to ensure that a lot of people also tap into the capital return on this. So that means, encourage it and encourage spending on it. Lots of societies will probably do exactly the opposite, and they will suffer as a consequence. And then something else will happen, which we already have seen for a long time, and that means that if they try to solve this by having more and more people not work and then giving them more and more money and then raising taxes more and more, then the big taxpayers will just move. People are getting more and more mobile all the time, so they'll just move to the ones who have a growth, to the societies that follow a growth mindset, and they will leave the societies that have a fixed mindset.
But it's quite interesting when you look at the math. In some parts of the world, especially Northern Europe, saving up and then investing to become financially independent is a pretty tall order. So rule of thumbs are that you need to save up like 25 salaries or 25 times what you actually need to spend per year. And here we are, of course, talking after tax. But if prices start to fall as a result of AGI and capital gains start to increase, then the rule of thumb that you can spend around 4% of your net worth might change to that you could spend, let's say, 8% of your net worth. And if your costs then half, let's say they go from you need €100,000 to sustain your lifestyle with your family to €50,000, then suddenly it's a very different dynamic of how much money you actually need to be safe financially. So I guess this is one of the actions, if we're going a little bit into advice, I think a lot of people should take seriously right now, is see if they could invest, not necessarily just in AI, in my opinion, but more broadly in equities to build up your own UBI, because I'm suspecting the government UBI could be a little bit delayed because it will be difficult to implement.
I think it's an interesting way you put it, to build up your own UBI, but I agree so much. I think there's something one we have to discuss here, and that is there are different inflation rates for different parts of the economy. And many years ago, I saw for the first time somebody calculating the cost of living really well. So that was the inflation rate for the really wealthy. I think that was in the 1990s, and where they calculated that the really wealthy actually experience a far higher inflation rate than other people. And that is because that people with low income, a very large part of their spending is on mass-produced, factory-produced stuff. But when you're very wealthy, you want limited edition designer bags and cars, and you want a house by the ocean front and so on. And these things were increasing very rapidly in price, same as some parts of the art market and colored diamonds and whatnot. And so what is likely to happen here is that the parts of the economy you cannot scale with AI, they will actually experience quite high inflation. So, which makes them interesting investment objects if you can get them, afford them. So, what can you not scale? You cannot scale the best locations of property. Although there are some attempts to do it because different places in the world we are building canals and islands and so on. So we are creating more coastal property for exactly for that reason. But that doesn't scale very, very well. That exclusive art cannot be scaled. This elusive Bugatti from 1929, they are not making more original matching numbers of those and so on. So all these things will probably go up a lot in price, whereas daily living costs will go down or have at least very limited inflation. So there's also a case for having, if it works for you somehow, to having a stake in these limited things. By the way, I have to say that another thing that doesn't scale very well is actually commodities. So it's not because we are running into geological scarcity of commodities, but the mining activity has been way too low for a long time. So I think that also commodities will be, for a period of time, maybe 5 or 10 years, they will get into a shortage situation and start going up in price.
Are you thinking metals mainly? Yeah.
Industrial metals, uranium also, but mainly metals, yeah, copper and so on.
We actually write a bit about the development of prices in our book, and like just as you allude to, the average comfortable living will probably decrease quite quickly, and we're already seeing it. So it's actually nothing new. We spend a lot less on food today than we did 50 years ago. People might not think so when they complain about food prices, but it has gone down from maybe 30% of a family's expenditure like 100 years ago to around 5 to 10% today. Clothing is about the same. So I think this will happen with transportation as well. We're transported better and more effortlessly today than 30, 40 years ago, but we spend about the same portion of our money on it. But I think that will change with automation. I think food will continue to go down in price. Clothes will become very cheap. And then we also wrote about how, like, we could call it average comfortable housing will become a lot cheaper because it can be mass produced and scaled quite effectively with robots. Um, so it's kind of interesting that we will see inflation and deflation at the same time. But do you think, well, when you mention deflation, do you think the way we measure inflation today, do you think that will turn into deflation?
I think the way inflation is measured by the institutions that do it generally is pretty good. I mean, I see that some people have kind of conspiracy theory approach to that, but I think they really do their best to make it representative of what is going on. Having said that, though, there's one element that they don't capture well at all, and that is the change in quality. So to compare the price of a phone today with the price of a phone 10 years ago doesn't at all capture the fact that a phone today is infinitely better quality than it was 10 years ago. So we will see a lot of things where the big change is actually in the quality more than anything else.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think computers would be the same, right? I mean, uh, a computer might cost half compared to 20 years ago, but it will be a million times faster, right? So comparing.
Better in every way. Yeah. And so, yeah, so if we go back to the mobile phone, it's actually a good example, I think, but because we are on the verge of getting personal AI. So now Apple is cooperating with OpenAI. So that is one step in that direction. That will probably go quite fast. But personal AI will be like your psychologist, your coach, your tutor. Will be like your cancer academy who knows you. It will be like your house doctor. It will be like your travel agency, and I can go on and on. And it will just be embedded in your phone, so you'll just get it included for the same price. And these are this is a very vast range of good services that will be added to your package there. So that will not be captured well by inflation, but it will be a very good thing.
So, talking about inflation, people very often actually follow inflation because they have debt and they're interested in the interest rates falling. Normally, that's the reason, right?
Right.
So, do you see central banks picking up on this AI inflation, and for that reason, we might go into negative territory in terms of interest rates?
Well, I think they will be driven by what the numbers are. So I have to say that the different central banks have a little bit different mandates. So most of them have a mandate which says to be around 2% headline inflation in the long term. But for instance, the Fed, the American Central Bank, has a dual mandate. So another part of the mandate is to secure or seek uh, close to full employment. So they're balancing those two things. And that means that if we get turbulence in the work market where we get an unemployment situation, they will also factor this in and perhaps be more tolerant of inflation. But there are two things that could make their tasks both mandates easier. First of all, situation we have now in um, I think I can say the most of the developed economies is actually structural labor shortage. And I remember when I was younger, the politicians would always talk about how many jobs their different initiatives created. It was very often bullshit, but but they said that because there was structural unemployment, and now we have structural underemployment. So the fact that we have this technology that can deliver automation comes in a very nice time. And for instance, you have these economies like China, South Korea, and so on, Eastern Europe, where the population numbers and the working population is falling or poised to fall very very quickly. But this shouldn't be a problem if they can make robots on factories and they could just get AI to do white collar work. So it comes in this sense, it comes in at a very nice time. And the other thing is that since it's deflationary on what really matters for their mandate, it gives them the freedom to maneuver. They don't have to restrain themselves because of inflation. Whether we will get negative rates or negative real rates, I don't know. But I think that the long-term prospect for inflation is pretty good. And a part of my rationale is it's also thinking about, so in my by now fairly long work career, there has been constant disinflation in the developed world. In the 1980s, I remember as a student, I bought some mortgage instruments where I got 18% interest. And it's just, interest rates just fell, inflation fell, and kept surprising economists, including many central banking economists. And there were different reasons for it. One reason was, of course, deflationary technologies. And another one was globalization, where you would always be able to outsource to the cheapest producer, such as China, for instance. And of course, many of these cheap producers changed to more open markets economies exactly in the 1980s. And the Berlin Wall fell in 1990. So all this opened up, created possibilities to produce cheaply. And then there was this third thing that is a little bit more difficult to analyze, but we know mechanically that velocity of money, that means how quickly money changes hands, have been steadily declining all the time. And that means that central banks could produce more and more money without creating inflation because as long as people were slower at spending the money, it had no effect that they produced more money. Then, so where it gets a little bit convoluted is to find out why did the velocity of money slow. And the best explanation that I know of is that it's actually demographic, that when people are young, they do like I did. So I leveraged myself as much as I could, and I bought I bought my first property, my first car, my first this and that. And then later, when I had these things, I started saving up instead. So demographic transition, where we have less and less or smaller part of the total population just joining the workforce, means that you don't have this factor speeding up the velocity of money, and you have the opposite. So I think back and say, okay, so those were three factors explaining why for a period of around 40 years we had structural disinflationary pressure. I don't think any of them are going away. I think the technology effect will accelerate. You can say that globalization actually is kind of reversing, because there's quite a lot of backsourcing, home sourcing right now, pulling out of China perhaps. But then if they pull out of China, they tend to move production to, say, Mexico or other places, or Vietnam. But the next step is that no, we just let robots do it. We can have it done right here in Silicon Valley or wherever we are, because it's robots. Robots are cheaper than labor anywhere, and so we'll just do it there. So that factor will still be there. I think the demographic factor will also still be there. So I think that we're getting back to where we were, which was that deflationary pressure, which is structural.
Yeah, a whole another component to this is, of course, the impact of longevity, because part of what Kurzweil and other futurists say is that we can expect to live quite a lot longer. Some go into the extremes and say we'll live forever and 1,000 years. But let's just say that we extend lifespan by 25%. At the same time, we have these deflationary pressures, right? So what does that mean, right? Does that further build the case that you need either some UBI from the government, because you'll have a longer life and probably a larger portion of that life where you're not working actively? Um, and would it also mean that we'll become even more deflationary because the average age will become older?
Well, it really depends a lot on the proportion of your life where you work. There's always already been in many countries an increase in the pension age based on an increase in the life expectancy. So as long as you do that, you actually, if you increase it 1 to 1, let's say life expectancy goes up from 76 to 78, and then you increase the pension age from 62 to 64, then that will increase the proportion of your life where you're working. And the reason I say that is because you have the same age, you have same part for education. So for that reason, it actually increases it. So as long as we are pretty good at tackling that, I don't think it will change the balance of how many percent of your life you work,
Unless, of course, we automate all the jobs away.
unless there's no work, or we all decide to. A few people work frantically, and the rest are just on UBI and on a beach.
So actually, I heard an argument from some people saying, we need to intervene. Robots may be able to do certain tasks or certain jobs at 10% of the cost of a worker. So let's subsidize the worker by, let's say, 50%, and then let's tax the robot until it becomes more expensive than the worker. So this would be a way to keep employment and delay automatization. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've always been against taxing workers in the first place, but that's my political view. I think you should tax consumption, but you should not tax work. Work is a good thing. But it brings us back to where we were very early in this discussion, which is about that when technology automates, you need to invest enough to create growth in GDP, and then it's not a problem.
Yeah, I also think that the idea of continuing to do work that a robot can do for 1/10 or 1/100th of the price would not be very satisfying. It's a little bit like, dropping something on the floor just to keep yourself busy picking it up. It doesn't make a lot of sense for me, and I also think, going back to the horses a little bit, we might actually be having a lot more fun, doing something that's has more meaning to us, even if it's just enjoying ourselves.
Yeah, I mean the feeling of fulfillment in life is not so good if you think that you're not really doing anything that's useful. A robot could do it much better. So that's not a solution, in my opinion.
So just going back to universal basic income. So like, how could we finance it? I guess that I've heard some different suggestions. Some say let's tax the rich. Let's have a 90% marginal tax on high income. Let's have a wealth tax that's super aggressive. Let's have a corporate tax that's very aggressive. Um, let's increase VAT. Well, there are different ways. There are some pros and cons with all of them, but you seem to lean towards VAT being the best solution.
I think VAT is one of. You could also have environmental taxes that are proportional to the externalities, negative externalities they create. But I think there's another tax that makes a lot of sense, and that is capital gains tax on private property, adjusted for inflation, and also where you can deduct your maintenance cost and so on. So a tax on your real inflation corrected net capital gain when you have, say, bought an apartment or a house, sell it 10 years later or 20 years later, and earn a lot of money. Why do I say that? Because this is rent seeking. What I mean by that is that what is the reason that the real inflation corrected value of a property, or especially the land it is on, goes up over time? The reason is that people become more wealthy, and because they become more wealthy, they can afford to pay more, so they bid each other up. But why do they become more wealthy? They become more wealthy because of innovation in the private sector, so in companies. So for that reason, I think it should be tax free when you invest in equities, but you should have this tax on passive gains in real estate, which is exactly how it works in Switzerland, where I live. And it's exactly the opposite how it, how it works in Denmark, where I used to live. And I have quite well connected to the Danish political community, and I've raised this for many politicians. And what they say is, yeah, we know that, but so many people own property that will never get elected. So it's kind of it's the situation is locked in. I guess it's the same in many other places.
Yeah, I think this is one of the bigger challenges. I mean, looking at this development, one of my major concerns is that Europe is falling behind. If we look at the screen now, we can see the GDP per capita for Europe compared to the US, compared to China. And well, Japan is falling off the map, but so is Europe. Um, and I think the AI development will accelerate this, because in Europe we talk about regulation. In the US, well, they are storming
Mm.
ahead with the leading companies, and China, from government side, seems to incentivize AI quite a lot.
Yeah, so I mean, you're touching a very interesting point because I do a lot of presentations, webinars, but also physical, and so do you. But I don't know if you have the same experience as I'm going to tell you about now. But when I talk about these amazing technologies coming up, including, of course, to a very high degree AI, my experience, if I do it in the US or in China, is that the questions are about how to make money, how to start a company, how to use it. But in Europe, people say, don't you think this is dangerous for? Or don't you think the society should intervene and stop and tax and regulate and so on? So there's much more growth mindset in China and I think Southeast Asia, across many nations, and in the US than there's in Europe. So Europe has more of a fixed mindset. Doesn't mean, of course, that all Europeans have a fixed mindset, but it's quite pervasive in the society. And we can see that certainly in the development of foundational technologies in AI, how Europe is way behind what is going on in China and the US. So yeah, of course, there can be many European companies that are then good at taking different models and creating agentic AI with swarms of small models that make their operations more effective. But Europe is definitely not leading on this.
Yeah, so if you read, well, I know you have this manifesto from Leopold, the former OpenAI employee who got fired. One of his points is actually how important it is to be ahead of AI. So he's talking more about security and weapons, but in a financial sense, it will also be game changing to have, let's say, AGI 1 year, half a year ahead of another continent. Um, so that is why I'm thinking that let's say the US gets AGI half a year ahead of China, and China get it half a year ahead of Europe, and they're also faster in the implementation phases. Then we can really see a further acceleration of the US and China being much more important in a financial sense and also power structure sense, and Europe really turning into a marginal power. Um, do you have the same concern, and do you think there's any way around this, or is that just what will happen?
I actually think that's what will happen. And so what he goes into is geopolitically. You have the economy and you have the military, and of course, in the long term, they tend to depend on each other. But what he describes and what you and I have also described in different ways, and what we've said and written is that as in different sectors, at a certain point, things can go really, really, really quickly, and a lot of technologies, a lot of businesses can become completely redundant in no time. So if you take it from a military point of view, maybe that aircraft carrier is completely useless at some point. Maybe manned aircraft also is completely useless. Maybe the future war is one where somebody presses a button and lets loose a million different autonomous drones, tiny drones that the size of insects, to make observations. Others that look like birds and people mistake them for that. Others that hunt down enemies on a one by one manner, and so on. So of course, if you're the first one who really master this combined arms system based on autonomous robots, you will have a huge advances militarily. But there's a clear parallel. If you are the ones who first find out how to run an insurance company with millions of clients but no employees at all, almost, or similar things, then you'll also have a huge economic advantage. And when the internet started, it wasn't anybody in Europe who made Amazon. It wasn't anybody in Europe who made Apple. We had Nokia and Ericsson, but they had Apple, and so yeah, they will in many cases be fastest, and they will have geopolitical advantage because of that. And it is US and China. China is very, very good at innovating. So
Yeah, one of the interesting points is so far nuclear weapons have actually been the big equalizer. I mean, it's kind of the reason that the damage and the risk of invading one country that has nuclear power is too great. But what Leopold suggests in the manifesto is also that AI will remove the power of nuclear, simply because we'll have so smart weapons that will be able to stop the nuclear rockets before they even take off. So, as I see it, we will see a power structure with the US probably being first and China being second, and nobody else will really matter in a geopolitical perspective.
Yeah, so of course it matters if you're a member of NATO, I guess. But I'm not sure about what he says about nuclear. I mean, who will prevent somebody making a submarine, stealth submarine that sails into a harbor and detonates on command, and nobody sees it before the explosion? So I think the smartness can also be applied to deliver nuclear.
Yes, I guess we will see. I think his point is that AI will detect very, very early if there's any activity, and they can
Mm.
kind of stop the activity before. I guess nobody knows whether that will be the reality. I think let's end maybe on a note discussing robots a little bit. So I think the way people envision robots are the robots as we see them right now, like the Tesla robot, the Boston robots. But if you read Ray Kurzweil's book, he actually envisions nanobots entering the markets in the 2030s. And a nanobot is basically a robot looking like a human. So the future might not be like armies or
Excuse me, talking. So it talks about nanobots, which are tiny, tiny bots that you can have in your bloodstream and your brain and so on. And then he talks about humanoid robots, which are many orders of magnitude bigger. So which one?
yeah, I think I both, right? So that robots will be both these micro nanobots that will work together to do some tasks, but also that we will see kind of the metal robots migrate into more humanoid robots with human-looking skin using nanotechnology. Um, so I think this changes the perspective a little bit of like how does a automated robotic society look like? It might actually in a slightly further future look like humans walking around and doing all these tasks, like we said, gardening, for example. It may not be a metal box. It may be something looking very similar to humans today.
Okay, so I have a couple of comments to that. First of all, I've been so inspired by Ray Kurzweil for many, many years. I think he is one of these unique people who come out and make predictions and statements that almost nobody believes in, and it turns out to be right again and again. Of course, not always, but to an impressive degree. But there are a few things that he predicts that I don't believe in, and I don't believe in these, mechanic nanobots in your bloodstream or inside your brain and so on. I think what works inside the body is biochemistry, not something mechanical. I mean, sort of. This is a generalization, and I think that what is emerging within biochemistry to heal and protect and build the body and the mind is amazing, and that's the overwhelmingly predominant way to go. The body will typically react quite negatively if you inject a lot of alien objects into it. But you can make it biochemically do a lot of things. When it comes to the humanoid robots, I think the experience is that they shouldn't look too human, because then it could become spooky. And he writes a little bit about that himself. So it experience also for people who have worked with the psychology of this is that you can make it look cute or friendly or something like that, but it shouldn't try to look like a human. That's just very unpleasant. So I think there will be many different shapes. There will also be modular robots where you can order or 3D print new limbs for it. I would definitely, if I had one like that, the first thing I would do would be to order a 3D print a corkscrew hand. They can open wine. We all have our passions, but it would, yeah. So it'll come in lots of different shapes. It will be some of them as we talked about earlier, will be as a service. Others will be in your home. If they're in your home, there will probably be a big effort to make them kind of disappear a little bit into the landscape when you're not using them. I can imagine a robot that looks like a coffee table when it's not in operation. Of course, you have to be a little bit careful. There's not a cup of coffee standing on its back when you ask it to do something. But there will be a lot of fun with making cool design. And we see that a lot with technology. That first we look at the utility, and once that is working, then we start making cool design version of them, and this would be amazing. I can also imagine a situation, for instance, where you come into let's say you come into a fashion shop, and you have these mannequins standing in the window, and then suddenly one of the mannequins, which are of course like robots, right? They are not real people. Turns around and walks around in the shop and goes in and changes to another outfit and then goes back in the window, or stop out in its way and help you a little bit because it has noticed that you've been looking at the same rack with socks for 3 minutes, so maybe you're in doubt about something. It will be very entertaining to see what will happen with robots.
Yes, I think let's end it there. I think that's a nice vision to people, for people to have in their heads. Also, generally there should be reason to be positive about the development. We might lose some jobs along the way, but we'll gain a lot of productivity, and probably, or most likely, will gain a lot of wealth. That, if distributed correctly, people shouldn't go without food or good housing or clothes on their backs in the future.
Yeah, I look forward, and thanks for the talk. It was a pleasure.